Hi, I'm Brent and I'm going to speak about the high degrees of Freemasonry. Now, I know it may be politically incorrect to say that there's anything higher than the Master Mason degree, but in fact, that's the term that has been used for centuries to define the various degrees and ceremonies and rites that exist after the Master Mason degree. So I'm not going to be politically correct. I'm going to use simple terminology that everyone understands. These are degrees that occur after the H.R.D.M legend in the Master Mason's degree. They're broadly termed as high degrees, and it's an area of research I'm very interested in. Now, I know that some contemporary authors, in fact many authors through the years, have maintained that pure Masonry is the entered apprentice, fellow craft, and Master Mason, and sometimes they throw in and including the Royal Arch. And they believe that everything beyond that is not part of Masonry and really is just superfluous and is dragging down the enterprise. I take a contrary position. I believe that the high degrees of Freemasonry have been an integral part of Freemasonry from our earliest days as a speculative institution, and they really deserve our respect and our support because it's part of the entire body of Freemasonry. Okay, let's get a few terms laid out here. We know that Freemasonry, as an organized institution in the British Isles, traces back to 1390 or so. This is the Regius Poem. It was published then. The Regius Poem is basically the bylaws of a guild, trade association. And organized Freemasonry probably goes back a few decades before that. Not much more, certainly no earlier than the 1300s. And by the way, I utterly reject the Knights Templar theory, the ancient mysteries theory, all of the other theories. I firmly believe that Freemasonry originated as a trade guild, as a labor union, if you will, and then evolved or transformed or transitioned into a men's fraternity in the 18th century. In the late 1590s, William Shaw in Scotland, the King's Master Mason, issued an order to the lodges in Scotland that they should start keeping minutes. And so it is from that period forward that we get the first records of individual Masonic lodges. So 1390 or so, we have the bylaws of the trade association of the guild. Guild my historian friends tell me that it's really a specific term applying to a city, but we've got the trade association for the Freemasons from 1390. About 200 years later, we start getting minutes. The oldest lodge minutes are the lodge at Aitchison Haven in Scotland. The lodge is now extinct, but you can see that on the 9th day of January, they had a new member, Robert Witherspoon, probably Witherspoon, and he became a fellow of the craft. And he chose George Antone and John Petted to be his intenders and instructors, very much like we do today. He paid a fee of 20 shillings, and he presented gloves to every master. So the gloves we have discontinued, having the fee we still have, and having instructors we still have. Now that's in 1598. The next year, we have extant minutes from the Lodge of Edinburgh, number 1. The organization still exists, the lodge still meets, but here is what to me is significant. In these early minutes, you can see that Brother George Patoun was chastised by the lodge because he had hired a Cowan to work on a chimney at the job site. A Cowan is a scab laborer, a Mason who had not gone through the guild training system. It didn't mean that he was unskilled, it didn't mean he didn't do good work, but it did mean that he didn't belong to one of the local lodges. What is significant is this is a labor organization behaving like a labor organization. They're chastising a member for not maintaining a closed shop and not using members of the lodge. Now, At this point, Freemasonry is a trade association. There's very, very little speculative nature to it. Probably some simple moralizing on the working tools: square your actions by the square of virtue, walk uprightly before God and men, and such like that. Circumscribe your passions with the compasses, and so on. And at this point, Freemasonry consists of 2 degrees: entered apprentice and fellowcraft. Now, there were masters. There were 2 types of masters. The presiding officer of a lodge, who was elected from time to time, was the master of the lodge. The member of the lodge that won the contract at a job site became the master mason at the job site. So this year, I might be the master mason as we're working on the tower at the church. 2 or 3 years later, another member of my lodge might be the master mason at the job site when they're working on the chapel at the work site. There was a transition or a constant flow between being a fellow of the craft and being master. Master was a temporary position of administration that you held. Now, in 1717, as we all know, the first Grand Lodge is formed in London. They didn't need Grand Lodges in Scotland because the local lodge system was strong enough that it operated well. But by 1717 in London, they were getting gentlemen masons in significant numbers, probably due to the Great Fire of London in 1666. The city had to be rebuilt, and the monopoly that the London Company of Masons exercised for stonework in the city of London was abrogated by the government. Any man who could pick up a stone and carry a trowel suddenly became a mason. They didn't have time to wait for an apprenticeship system. And in 1717, the organization is pretty well transformed itself into a speculative organization, a gentleman's group, because we think the London Company of Masons started admitting honorary members after it lost its royal monopoly over the construction trade. In 1717, when the Grand Lodge is formed, it has 2 degrees, the same as they had in Scotland at Mary's Chapel, as far as we can tell, the same that they'd had from the earliest records: that of apprentice and that of fellowcraft. In 1723, James Anderson, when he publishes his Constitutions of the Freemasons, again, when you read it carefully, you see that there are only 2 types of members: apprentices and fellowcrafts. Now, there are hints. The Graham manuscript from the 1690 give hints of a ceremony beyond the fellowcraft degree, but there's no hard evidence. The hard evidence does not come until 1725. And there at a meeting of the Philo Musicae et Architecturae Societas, you can see that Charles Cotton and Papillon Ball were regularly past masters, and that Brother Germaniani was regularly past fellowcraft and masters. So there we have, in 1725, the first high degree in Freemasonry. And a high degree being a ceremony that continues and expands upon the earlier degrees, continuing the legends, expanding on the legends, and bestows an additional level of membership. So in 1725, high degrees are introduced to Freemasonry. Now, what's interesting to me is the response of the Grand Lodge. It's kind of a, this is nice. If you don't rock the boat, y'all come on. So the Master Mason's degree was instantly absorbed into the Grand Lodge structure. In 1730, the absolute airtight evidence of a new degree occurs when we see Masonry Dissected published that year. Masonry Dissected was an expose of the secrets of Freemasonry, the most complete and detailed of its time, and it includes the ceremonies of entered apprentice, fellowcraft, and master. Now, here's some interesting information, side information about Masonry Dissected, which lets us make some deductions. October 20th, 1730, the first edition is advertised. The 21st and 23rd, the second edition is advertised. That means they sold out in one day. On the 24th, it's reprinted in Reed's Weekly Journal. On October 31st, a third edition is advertised. They've sold out again, and by November 3rd, we're talking about only some 2 weeks after it comes out, a pirated edition is available. And it went through edition after edition. People bought them as fast as they could print them. Now, certainly there was interest among the citizens of London in Freemasonry. They were interested in the rituals. I don't think there was the interest there that was going to have a sellout of these editions. Here's what Harry Carr had to say about it. Freemasonry was growing in popularity. There was a total absence of printed materials, and Masonry Dissected provided the best guidance to lodges in doing and operating the new ceremony of Master Mason. So there's our first high degree, 1725, the Master Mason's degree. It did not exist prior to that, certainly did not exist in any of the written documents of Freemasonry. There are hints of it existing earlier, but there it is, 1725. Now, a mere 8 years later, in 1733, we have published Rawlinson's list of lodges. It lists all of the lodges in London, and we see that lodge number 115 in London was a Scotch Mason's lodge. Now, what is significant about this is when you look at the list, they either say nothing about it, they say it's a Master's Lodge, a Master Mason's Lodge, and then here they have a Scotch Mason's Lodge. The next year in 1734, Pine's list of lodges again includes number 115, describes it as a Scots Mason's Lodge. We don't know what they were doing, but it was something different than a Master Mason's Lodge. 1735, we get to the Lodge at the Bear, and this would be a tavern or a pub that had the sign of a bear outside of it in Bath. And there, the minutes, we see that a lodge of masters met, and they made and admitted Scots Master Masons. Some different ceremony is going on. So 1717, the Grand Lodge is formed. 1723, we have the constitutions of the Freemasons, and we're still operating as a two-degree system. 1725, the Master Mason's degree appears in the minute books. 1730, a full exposure occurs in Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, and 3 years after that, we start seeing evidence of yet a new degree, a Scots Master's degree. So here in our timeline, something is happening. Now, we don't have any records of the Scots Mason's degrees yet, but we know that something different is happening. Now, in 1737, again, now it's only 4 years after the first mention of a Scots Mason's Lodge, Michael Andrew Ramsay gives his famous oration in Paris. It's known as Ramsay's Oration. Here's what's significant about this is we now have a new ritual thread introduced into this mixture. Ramsay announces, without any evidence, that our ancestors, the Crusaders, and so now he's introducing the idea into Freemasonry that the craft originated with the Crusades. Well, this is at a time when there's high interest in things chivalric, knighthood, the history of knights is of great interest. And Ramsay's seed is going to bear fruit a few years later. 1738, the year after Ramsay's Oration, in Lisbon, there is a lodge simply called the Irish Lodge. Well, the first papal bull came out against Freemasonry, and the worshipful master gave orders that there should be no more meetings of the lodge. He closed it down. The Inquisition, nonetheless, called in the master of the lodge and interviewed him. That has got to be sort of a disquieting experience, like having Don Corleone inviting you in to have a discussion about your business activities and how it interferes with his family. So the master of the lodge is called into the Inquisition. Hugo O'Kelly says before the Inquisition, and we know this because the minutes of the Inquisition have been preserved, there are more classes of Masons which are called excellent Masons and Grand Masons, which are above all others. Now, we're not sure what he means. Is a Grand Mason simply a Grand Lodge officer, so that the Grand Deacons, the Grand Wardens, the Grand Master are above all others? Or is this the name of a different degree? And what about an excellent Mason? Is this a different degree? Does this mean if you're a past master, you're an excellent Mason? We're not sure. But we do know that by 1738, the Inquisition is told that there exist other classes of Masons. 1740, an old lodge number 1. This is the Lodge of Antiquity, now number 2 in London. 9 members were this evening made Scotch Master Masons. Something's going on. The same year, at the Lodge of the Rummer in Bristol, ordered and agreed other members of this lodge that are already Master Masons may be made Scotch Master. Now that's significant. We now have, 7 years after the first appearance of the Scotch Master Lodges, that if you're going to be a Scotch Master, you must already be a Master Mason. So 1740 is only 15 years after the first written appearance of the Master Mason degree, and now being a Master Mason is established as a foundation, and then you can take the next step to that of Scotch Master. Now, it's very exciting that we have preserved the minutes from a Berlin lodge in 1742. That they exist is a miracle. During World War II, the Nazis captured and confiscated the records of the Grand Orient de France, carried them back to Berlin. When the Russians captured Berlin, or captured their part of Berlin, the Nazi records were carried back to Russia. And only within the last few decades have the records been returned from Russia to the Grand Orient de France. And we can see that in 1742, there is a Scottish lodge in Berlin. So now we have minutes of a Scottish lodge. We still don't know what they were doing, but it was something different above and beyond the Master Mason's degree. Now in 1742, there is a very curious newspaper account of a parade in Dublin. It's maybe the first evidence of the Royal Arch degree. And I say maybe because the newspaper account is ambiguous. They're describing a parade, and you can see what it says. Fourthly, the Royal Arch carried by 2 excellent Masons. Fifthly, the Master with all his proper implements. Now, what does it mean to carry the Royal Arch? Are they carrying a replica of the Ark of the Covenant? That could be the Royal Arch. Are they carrying a replica of Noah's Ark? In French, arche means both an arch and then a boat, ark. So perhaps they were carrying a replica of Noah's Ark, perhaps it was a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, or since this was a parade, perhaps the deacons were carrying 2 staves that had an arch, perhaps with ribbons hanging down from it, and the Master was walking underneath the arch. We don't know. So maybe, just maybe, this is the first reference to the Royal Arch degree. 1743 in London, the next year, we now have evidence of the Royal Order of Scotland. The Scotch H.R.D.M of Kilwinnig is the organization. We know it today as the Royal Order of Scotland. And so here we have records in 1743 that it's holding a meeting in London. The same year, 1743, another very interesting and significant event occurs. Baron von Hund in Paris claims that he was initiated into a branch of Masonry when he was visited by the Red Feather Knight. Masked men appeared, initiated him into a branch of Masonry, and basically the secret of this branch of Masonry is that Freemasonry is descended from the Knights Templar. Now, recall that when Michael Andrew Ramsay gave his oration, it was the Crusaders. Now the Crusaders have become more specific, and they're the Knights Templar. So what we have is von Hund is told that there are unknown superiors, secret men that run the Interorder of Freemasonry of Templars, and they have selected von Hund to spread this branch of Masonry throughout Europe. Von Hund does this. The Knights Templar, or in fact the organization is called the Strict Observance because members swear to strictly follow, to strictly observe the instructions of their unknown superiors. This spreads throughout Germany, throughout France, throughout Europe, and all of a sudden the Templar tradition has now become a part of Freemasonry. So you can see layer after layer we are building up on the body of Freemasonry. And we're talking at the earliest ages, 1743. This is only 28 years after the formation of the first Grand Lodge. Something is going on. Now, in 1743 in France, this is a big year for Freemasonry, we find out that Scottish masters, maîtres écossais, exist in France. This is yet another degree of Masonry. And it appears that a provincial lodge writes to the Grand Lodge and is saying, these guys are showing up in our meetings, say they have special privileges. Among the privileges, they don't have to take their hats off, they don't have to remove their swords, they don't have to stand when everyone else stands, because they are Scottish masters, and they're asking for instructions from headquarters. In 1744, in France, there's an exposé, Le Franc-Maçon. In Le Franc-Maçon, they talk about maîtres écossais. So it is a fourth degree of Masonry. And now we're getting more and more written evidence that something is there. Now we switch back to the other side of the channel to 1744. And I might add that these evolutions, the evolution of these high degrees and of the structure of Freemasonry is occurring continuously on both sides of the channels in various cities. These are just the fragments of evidence that have survived. And so now in 1744, we have some pretty clear evidence that there is an additional degree known as the Royal Arch. Here is Fifield de Ciney's A Serious and Impartial Inquiry that was published in Ireland, and he says he is informed that in the city of York is held an assembly of Master Masons under the title of Royal Arch Masons. Okay, this is now a special group of men known as the Royal Arch. So while that 1742 newspaper account might or might not have referred to the Royal Arch degree, we now see in 1744 that there is in York evidence of the Royal Arch existing. This is probably where the name York Rite comes from, because here the first evidence that the Royal Arch existed or is published is in York. Now in 1744, the same year, another exposé is published in France, Le Parfait Maçon, the Perfect Mason. Now we get a hint of what the Scots Mason's degree may be. Now, I qualified all of that. It's a hint, it may be. You have to take exposés with a grain of salt. Are they reporting accurately a universal ritual or truth of Freemasonry? Are they reporting accurately a local variation or a local custom? Have they filled in blanks with their imagination? Are they just trying to make a buck and they don't care what they say? We're not sure. But we do know that in 1744, Le Parfait Mason says that instead of weeping over the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, the Écossais are concerned with rebuilding it. And Zerubbabel returns to rebuild the temple. Now this we know is a biblical story. We also know it is one of the most common threads of high degree Freemasonry. Zerubbabel returning from Babylon to Jerusalem, he brings Jewish Masons with him. They are going to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. This is the Temple of Zerubbabel, the second temple. And so it is a common ritual theme, a common plot theme, if you will, in high degrees of Freemasonry. Next year, 1745, the Broken Seal. They're talking about the Crusader princes, and so now we see Ramsay, and they're talking about rebuilding the temple. So now we see a blend of the Crusader myth and the rebuilding myth. 1745, the Order of the Freemasons betrayed. They're talking about, again, Écossais Masons of a higher degree. 1750, more evidence of the Royal Order of Scotland. The brethren of the H.R.D.M are desired to take notice, and H.R.D.M is the name uniquely associated with the Royal Order of Scotland. 1752, we now have strong evidence of the Royal Arch degree being practiced in England. There has been a fraud perpetrated in London. Gentlemen known as leg of mutton masons are taking men for a fee, and the fee is a dinner of mutton. They will give them a degree, and presumably they would continue conferring the degrees as long as they got free dinners. Well, these leg of mutton Masons are examined by the Grand Lodge of Ancients, and what they and as part of the examination, they determine that they know nothing about the Royal Arch degree. Well, here is evidence, now I think pretty airtight evidence, that the Grand Lodge of Ancients is working the Royal Arch degree and thinks it's important enough that they examine these fraudsters, these hoaxers, these scam artists, to see if they know anything about the Royal Arch. Now, the next year comes the big event in Royal Arch Masonry. The first record, the first minute of the Royal Arch degree being conferred. Just as in 1725 we have the first minute of the Master Mason's degree being conferred. In 1753, this is only 28 years after the first conferral of the Master Mason's degree, the Royal Arch degree is recorded in a minute book. And this occurs in Fredericksburg, Virginia. It's not in London, it's not in Ireland or Paris or Edinburgh, it's in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And we have 3 men are raised to the degree of Royal Arch Mason. So we can absolutely date from 1753 onward that the Royal Arch degree is part of the fabric of Masonry. Now here's an interesting thing that happens in London. By the time they start talking about, or in England I should say, by the time they start talking about the Royal Arch degree, they've stopped talking about the Scots Master's degree. It's as if all the Scots Master's lodges disappeared and suddenly springing up are Royal Arch lodges. What happened? Well, one of the things that may have happened is that in 1745, Bonnie Prince Charlie returns to Scotland, raises an army with the plans of invading England and resuming the throne as the Stuarts should have it. He's the Catholic pretender. His father, James, is the old pretender. Bonnie Prince Charlie is the young pretender. And at the Battle of Culloden, the Scots forces that are supporting Bonnie Prince Charlie are utterly destroyed, utterly routed. Bonnie Prince Charlie returns to France and is never seen again. However, from 1745 onwards, it is not politically correct to be Scottish in England. The Scots are viewed as traitors to the United Crown. They're viewed with suspicion as people that are not loyal and want to overthrow the king. So perhaps what happened is all the Scots Masters lodges suddenly became Royal Arch lodges. They suddenly took a prominent feature of the Scots Masters ceremony and transformed and changed the name and kept everything else the same. We don't know, but it makes sense. Now in 1761, we have another event happen in the evolution of high-degree Freemasonry. Stephen Morin, a Frenchman from Bordeaux, he was a negociant, someone who's a wine merchant. He's immigrating to the Caribbean where he's going to set up a business. And the emperors of the East and West, and this could be a separate and distinct organization. There's some evidence that this is simply the Grand Lodge of France, the same men changing the color of their jerseys at a meeting, and now they're the emperors of the East and West. Well, whatever the group is, they issue a patent to Morin to establish perfect and sublime masonry in all parts of the world. Perfect masonry are the degrees conferred in the Lodge of Perfection. Sublime masonry are the degrees above the Lodge of Perfection. So that would be the Princes of Jerusalem, the Knights Rose-Croix, the Knights Kadosh. Well, in 1763, Morin arrives in Santo Domingo in the Caribbean. What we don't know is we don't know what degrees constitute fully perfect and sublime masonry. We know that's what he's authorized to spread, and we know that today we understand those as the Lodge of Perfection and then the higher degrees, but we don't know what he had in 1763. Well, in 1763, we have the first major expose of high-degree Freemasonry that achieved any success, Les plus secrets mystères, the most secret mysteries of the high degrees of Freemasonry unveiled. And it has a 7-degree system. Perfect elect Mason, elect of the 15, senior architect, Prussian Knight, elect of Perignon, junior architect, Knight of the Sword. These degrees, when you read them, are incredibly similar to Scottish Rite degrees that we confer today. Now you look at some of the degrees in Les Plus Secrets and you say, where on earth did these come from? And you look at other degrees and you say, oh my gosh, if we chop this in half, we'd have the 9th degree and the 10th degree. Or you'd look at it and you say, yeah, I recognize the princes of Jerusalem here are part of that ceremony. So we've got in 1763, the year that Morin lands in the Caribbean, an expose of the high degrees appearing. Now in 1763, Stephen Morin creates a new organization, or we believe he creates it. He's now talking about the Order of the Royal Secret. It's also known as the Rite of Perfection. And the question is this 25-degree system what Morin brought with him from France, and it was given to him by the emperors of the East and West, or is this something that he created entirely himself out of existing pieces? Perhaps he had a copy or obtained a copy of Les Plus Secrets, and he took portions of those degrees and put them into his new order. We don't know, but there's a strong suspicion that Morin was the driving force behind this. Now, sometime between 1763 and 1767, Morin appoints Henry Andrew Franken. He's a Dutch merchant headquartered in Albany who makes his living going down the Hudson, sailing to the Caribbean, selling cheap goods from New York, picking up cheap goods from the Caribbean, going back up to New York and selling them there. So Franken is going back and forth. We know that Morin arrives in the Caribbean in 1763, and we know that in 1767, Franken establishes a Lodge of Perfection in Albany, New York. So sometime in that 4-year period, Franken and Morin meet. We don't know exactly when they met, but we know it had to be before 1767, and it had to be after 1763. Now, the most significant thing that Franken did is he transcribed the rituals of the Order of the Royal Secret into at least 4 books. And so there we have the earliest English language version of the high degrees of Freemasonry. 1769, 2 years after the Lodge of Perfection in Albany, we have the first evidence of the Knights Templar degree being conferred. Now, I want to emphasize here that I talk about evidence of the degree. This is when we have minutes, we have an announcement, we have something that tells us it's actually going on. The ceremonies probably existed earlier than that. They just made it into the minute books. Now, interestingly, the Knights Templar first appear in the United States in minute books. And St. Andrew's Royal Arch Lodge, this is the famous lodge that met at the Green Dragon Tavern. Paul Revere was a member of St. Andrew's Lodge, Joseph Warren, John Hancock. It was out of the Green Dragon Tavern that the wild tribe of Mohawk Indians went down to the docks and threw tea overboard into Boston Harbor. Now, taking a much larger leap forward, in 1801, the Mother Supreme Council of the Scottish Rite is created in Charleston. Stephen Morin's 25-degree Order of the Royal Secret has now had an additional 8 degrees added to it. Some administrative weaknesses, fatal weaknesses from an organizational point of view, have been corrected, and now we have yet a new high degree system created in Charleston, of all places. It's interesting to me that the first appearance of the Royal Arch is in Fredericksburg, Virginia. The first appearance of the Knights Templar, or the first appearance of the Knights Templar is in Boston, and then the Mother Supreme Council of Scottish Rite Masonry is formed in Charleston. So we now are getting sophisticated, highly organized, high-degree systems all on top of Freemasonry. And yet again, the reaction of the Grand Lodge is, this is interesting. If you don't rock the boat, you all can come aboard. So that has been the approach of Freemasonry to the high degrees. Well, what happens after 1801? Well, it's not nearly as interesting as the early days. And that's going to be the subject for my next presentation. Thank you very much.